if you'd like to refer back to the session. If you need to miss any certain portion of this session, it should be available to you later. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. Today's session will look at San Francisco's design review and regulations relevant to historic properties. We have planners and a practicing architect on our panel of speakers who will speak for approximately 60 to 75 minutes total. We will close with a 15-minute quiz session and a question and answer period. There is also a chat box which is visible to all participants. A chat box is located on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. If you would like to comment or interject, or if you have any technical problems, you may chime in through the chat box. If you are connected to a mobile device using the Adobe Connect mobile app, certain interactive features may not be available to you, but you should still be able to watch and listen to the presentation. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen. Once your hand is raised, we will grant you voice access at an appropriate time in the presentation. This will allow you to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask a question in person. If for some reason your sound does not work, you will need to type in your question or response in the chat box. I am now going to introduce today's speakers. Tim Fry is Preservation Coordinator at the San Francisco Planning Department. He has over a decade of experience in urban planning, having previously worked for the City of Chicago's Historic Preservation Division. Mr. Fry holds an MS in Historic Preservation from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a BA from DePaul University in Urban Studies. As Preservation Coordinator, Mr. Fry staffs the San Francisco Historic Preservation Commission and oversees long-range planning, entitlement review, survey, and designation responsibilities of the department's preservation staff. He serves on the board of the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions and is a member of its training committee. Jeff Jocelyn is Director of Current Planning at the San Francisco Planning Department, where he oversees permitting, zoning, historic preservation, and the Planning Information Center. Mr. Jocelyn has previously worked in Portland as a principal of Strategic Design and Development Services and as a project manager for KLK Consulting. He has more than 25 years of experience in planning, architecture, economic development, and urban design. Andrew Wolfram has more than 24 years of experience working on the adaptive reuse of significant historic buildings. He has led many projects from conception through construction and has been responsible for comprehensive urban planning and feasibility studies. In the San Francisco Bay Area, he served as project architect for the celebrated Ferry Building renovation, led the rehabilitation of the iconic Art Deco Pacific Telephone Building, and has worked on a number of projects at the Presidio, ranging from cultural landscape assessments to the conversion of the Public Health Services Hospital to multifamily apartments. Andrew is Vice President of the San Francisco Historic Preservation Commission and is an expert on the preservation of modern resources. He lectures extensively about modern architecture. Without further ado, we will now begin the presentation with Tim Fry.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this next installment in CPF's training, and we're going to cover, as you know, city regulations and design guidelines. So just to give you a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today, we'll briefly look at the origins of historic resource regulation in San Francisco and the policies and guidelines that provide a framework for our review process. We'll then get a sense of what the department means when we refer to a building as a historic resource, meaning how many buildings are we really talking about, and when does the Historic Preservation Commission get involved in a project. And then next we'll talk about the purpose of design guidelines, their application by the department, and then Commissioner Wolfram will discuss the role of the Historic Preservation Commission in a little more detail. He'll walk excuse me, he'll walk you through the Secretary of the Interior standards, how they're used successfully and sometimes not so successfully. And then finally, Jeff Jocelyn will talk about the application of several of the department's design guideline documents. And we're going to cover just briefly some the new garage guidelines and window replacement guidelines, but we're certainly happy to take any specific questions regarding scopes of work or the city's application of design guidelines that you have. So again, just to give you a quick overview of preservation planning in San Francisco, it formally began in 1967 through the adoption of Article 10 of the Planning Code. This article of the Planning Code gives the Board of Supervisors regulatory power to designate properties and districts as having some sort of aesthetic, historical, or cultural significance for the city. Through that article, the Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board was formed. At the time, the advisory board, again, was advisory only, and they provided advice to the Planning Commission and to the Planning Director on preservation-related activities in the city. In 1985, their regulatory powers were expanded and with the creation of the Downtown Plan. The Downtown Plan lives in Article 11 of the Planning Code, and it primarily provides oversight and designation authority for the city for buildings located within our C3 zoning districts. Primarily, these designations are based on architectural character, and they have slightly different requirements than Article 10, but they still permit local designation, and these properties were also reviewed by the Landmarks Board and the Planning Department. In 1995, the city received certified local government status through the State Office of Historic Preservation. This is primarily to provide us some autonomy for from the state under the much broader umbrella of federally funded projects. And the requirements of this status were to align our preservation program to best practices established by the National Park Service. But most of you are probably familiar now with the Historic Preservation Commission, which was created in 2009 through a voter-approved charter amendment. And the 2009 amendment dissolved the Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board, created the HPC, as we call them, as a decision-making body with binding authority over designated properties. And this map is to give you an idea of really what we're talking about when we refer to the HPC's review authority. The yellow outlined areas are our locally landmarked districts under Article 10. The blue areas are our conservation districts protected under Article 11 of the Planning Code. And the red dots you see interspersed throughout the city are our individually designated landmark properties under Article 10. There's often a perception that many more buildings are protected under these code provisions, but you can see the large part of the city is covered in or shaded gray, which makes up about over 96% of the city, and also shows that a good portion of the city is over 45 years in age. That gray area there, which is primarily left to staff. While we have a number of preservation staff available to provide technical assistance when needed, the HPC is only involved in the review of the projects associated with buildings in the highlighted areas, the yellow, the blue, and the red dots. The gray areas of the map are where we need to do a little more work up front, and where I'd say design guidelines probably play a more crucial role in helping us balance the goals of a property owner under the broader umbrella of the goals of the city. And before I start talking about guidelines, I wanted to mention a couple sort of universal truths about design guidelines. And it's important to note first that design guidelines by themselves do not guarantee good design, but these underlying elements are what any design guideline document should convey in order to be useful. First is consistency. The guidelines need to be fair. They should have the ability to be applied equally. To be effective, they shouldn't appear arbitrary or be arbitrary in any way, and essentially lay out what the ground rules are for people to play. Second is predictability. They need to make sense. They need to be clear and focus, allow us to share a common language about design. And over time, effective guidelines will pave the way for easier application because everyone is, once they're learned, are able to work within or understand the parameters or the framework outlined by the guidelines. But finally, the guidelines should be flexible. They should not be so prescriptive. They have a limited shelf life. They don't are not allow for innovation or exceptional design. There's nothing wrong with revisiting and updating guidelines based on changing needs or values over time, but good guidelines should be able to accommodate some of these changes and stand the test of time. And when we think about why we have design guidelines based on the goals we just went over, I think this slide can explain itself. These are some concepts most of us can agree with. All sound like good things for us to aspire to as a city, and guidelines should be balanced and should be a collection of our shared values for the built environment. So with these goals in mind, design guidelines can be developed and applied at varying levels and for various types of projects. In terms of guidelines for historic resources, which is what we'll be talking about today, they're usually the most detailed because they often focus on very specific elements or characteristics of a property, or in the case of a historic district, an area. So if we look at the slide or the graphic in front of you right now, for example, the vision at the bottom of the slide is sort of like our San Francisco general plan. It's and an example of that vision could be encourage residential development and preserve historic properties. The next layer there under base zoning for a lot in a residential area may specify the maximum height and size that a building is allowed of a building that's allowed at the site. And then as we move along the arrow, starting at the very left, with baseline design requirements, an example of a baseline design requirement could be to encourage the use of a gable roof form in a neighborhood where the gable roof is a common feature. A special zoning district overlay on top of that may be neighborhood specific. It may dictate the lot size, a front yard setback, or rear yard requirements in order to address contextual issues within that specific neighborhood. But then as we move to historic districts and landmarks, we get a little more specific. For example, historic districts are about preserving overall neighborhood character. They may focus more on preserving visual harmony within the grouping of buildings rather than general parameters seen in the previous two examples. And then finally, landmarks are the most specific usually in terms of guidelines because we're aiming to preserve specific features and elements of a designated property, and usually those designation reports that are associated with those landmarks will provide very specific guidance on what those elements are that need to be preserved. So in the last two components, historic districts and landmarks, is where the Secretary of the Interior standards come into play. So now Andrew will give a brief overview of the Historic Preservation Commission and the Secretary of the Interior standards.
So,
I had one more
the
slide.
Secretary of the Yes,
Sorry,
you did
you
have
can
one more
skip.
slide. Do you want to go back?
Sorry, I did. You can skip it. I'll go back to it.
Okay. The Secretary of the Interior standards were developed by the Department of the Interior, and originally in the late 1960s and 1970s, and the additional guidelines were developed in the 1970s. And originally they were developed as a national standard that would guide historic preservation and historic rehabilitation, which would be the taking of a property and bringing it up to today's standards for use and for code and life safety. And it was it's been used especially to guide historic tax credit projects. So it's something that the National Park Service or the State Historic Preservation Office use as their guideline for all projects to be in compliance if they're receiving those types of tax credits. In San Francisco, the Secretary of Interior standards are the basis that we at the Historic Preservation Commission and the Planning Department will use to view any project that is undertaken on a designated resource, a historic landmark or a building in a landmark district. So for those buildings, compliance with the standards for a project, whether it's an addition, a renovation, some kind of modification, is required in order to achieve approval. For other projects that relate to buildings that would be considered historic on the basis of CEQA and the California Environmental Quality Act, but might not be designated, if you're undertaking a project and you utilize the standards, it's certainly going to be much easier for it to be approved by the planning department. So the standards are a useful guideline regardless of the type of project that you're used. And the standards are, there's 10 of them, and they're not exactly like the 10 commandments in that they do leave some room for interpretation, and I'll just kind of run through what the intent of each of them is. So the intent of standard number 1 is the idea that historic buildings were designed for a specific use, and that use is integral to the character of the building. And so that if you're going to be changing a use, let's say if you're taking a building that was originally built as a historic house, for example, and you're making it into an office building, that might change the character of the building. Or if you're taking a building that was built as a train station and turning it into an office building, that's going to potentially be a change in the character of the space. So that you should look for new uses that really don't change, that require minimal changes to the building, that are very sensitive to its original use. The second one is about maintaining the historic character of a property. And it's very much focused on not removing historic materials or features or spaces of that property, so that every building, every site has things that are really what give it its historic character, things that make it significant. And those things that make it significant might be certain features like exterior trim details, the way a staircase and a stoop are designed on the outside, columns that have capitals, those kinds of things, so that in order to retain the historic character, you wouldn't remove it. And some of them might be more spatial. Let's say there's an open porch. Well, if you fill in the open porch, you're affecting not only the character of the building, but the space, some of those sort of spatial features. The third standard is really looking at that there's a reason a property is historic because it was built at a certain time period or over a certain time period, and that it should be recognized a record of that particular time period. And that if you have a building and you make modifications, or if you do things to it that create a false sense of history, then that is not appropriate. That is confusing to people trying to understand it. If you're doing an addition to a building and or let's say you're replacing a carriage house or garage that was originally there, but you have no idea what it looked like originally, there's no documentation, then you shouldn't make it look like something that's conjectural, that you're just guessing at it, unless you really have documentation about what it was like. The fourth standard is focused on the fact that buildings do change over time, and that some of those changes might also be historically significant. So to really understand the whole history of a property is important. Just because the building was built in 1890 and it had an addition in 1920, you might think, well, I'm going to just take it back to 1890. Well, no, it might be that what was done in 1920 is also historically significant. The fifth standard speaks to the fact that there are that features that, like craftsmanship, example of specific construction techniques, are important and should be preserved. The sixth standard is very much focused on the idea that you should try to, you should give your effort should really be focused on repairing historic features or replacement of this. And this is very much based on the idea that with historic buildings, authenticity is really important. That's kind of the basis of the whole idea of historic preservation, that in order for something to be historic, it needs to be authentic as well, that it should be the way it was built originally, so things that were actually old and constructed by people 100 years ago. The seventh standard is just about making sure that when you're doing work to a building, that you use treatments that don't damage it, that you don't sandblast features and take the finish and reduce the impact the historic elements. The eighth standard is about archaeological resources, that they should be protected and preserved, and if they're found, that you need to undertake mitigation measures. The ninth standard is a very important one. It's one that we deal with quite a lot. And it's the idea that if you're doing an addition to a historic building, that it should not destroy the historic materials, that the addition should be differentiated from the old, but still be compatible with the old building. And so that means compatible in terms of the massing, the size, the scale, the materials. And this is a standard that is one that is highly subject to interpretation. What does it really mean to be differentiated from the old but compatible? How differentiated? Are we talking about, if you're doing an addition to a house, is it differentiated because you use a different type of siding but everything still looks pretty much like the old house? Or is it differentiated in that the addition should be all glass when the house was mostly wood, so that it's contrast? So this is one that's very much subject to interpretation. And then the final standard is the idea that if you're doing an addition or some related new construction, that the work you should do, if it were to be removed, you'd still have a sense or the character of the original building, so that this feature would be essentially reversible. So that you don't do something so that if it was taken away, would basically undermine the existing historic building.
Hi, Andrew. We have some people who wanted you to go over number 6 again briefly, just because we had some audio hiccups earlier.
Oh, sure. Okay. So number 6 is the idea that historic features should be repaired rather than replaced. That as the initial effort, that all efforts should be made to try to repair historic features such as windows, trim, side, rather than just replacing them. Are we still having trouble with audio? Am I blipping out? Do you still get my audio, Jonan? Are you getting my audio? Okay. So I'm going to try number 6. Okay. Number is about the idea that deteriorated historic features should be repaired rather than replaced. So that if you have a feature that is damaged or in somewhat poor condition, you should do everything you can to repair the feature, because this is historic buildings are very much about authenticity. So in order for something to be authentic, it has to be the original materials that were there, that were built by craftsmen, let's say 100 years ago. And that if you're going to repair it, that you're still working on that original authentic feature. And if you replace it, you're doing something new, which even though it might look the same, is still going to have different characteristics. So that is really the effort that you should really try to repair rather than replace. And it sounds like number 8, also people may have missed number 8, which is about significant archaeological resources, that if you find archaeological resources, that you should undertake mitigation measures to protect them, to preserve them. So I'm going to continue, assuming that everybody heard that section. So moving on, the standards they really guide the work that we do, the work that we see, the work that comes into us. And they're a tool to help us preserve buildings. They're also a tool that are useful for architects and owners to obtain approvals. If they follow the standards, it's much easier to obtain approvals. They all projects in historic districts and historic buildings. They are not a tool to dictate style, so they're not saying that if you're doing an addition to a Victorian that your addition has to look like a Victorian. They're not that prescriptive. They don't regulate the uses, and they aren't about limiting growth or density. So I'm going to move on a little bit, and I hope everybody has sound, because it looks like some of the comments still people are saying they don't have sound. But hopefully we are still being broadcast. So a little bit about the Historic Preservation Commission. It's a 7-member body of professionals. The Historic Preservation Commission was created by Prop J, started in 2009. We're all appointed by the mayor. The Board of Supervisors approves us. And we primarily focus on buildings that are in landmarks or in landmark districts. We give them any building that's in a landmark district or as an individual landmark would need a permit to alter. A building in an Article 11 district would need a certificate of appropriateness. So we have different types of approval processes. We adopt surveys that are undertaken by the planning department and context statements. And then we also have the ability to forward recommendations for landmarks, new landmarks in landmark districts. We have a landmark It looks like I lost audio for a second.
Andrew, your
Okay, am I
audio
back?
is back on. Yeah, you're back on. It might be a bandwidth issue on your end, so if you have any extra windows open
possible.
other than the try to close anything that you don't need open.
No, I just have this open, but it might be
Okay.
I'm on Wi-Fi in our office, but it should be adequate. Apologize about that. Hopefully, you can hear me now. Okay, where did Jonathan? Can you tell me where that cut off?
Hey, I think you were talking about landmark districts at the time.
Okay. I apologize for the audio difficulties here. Hopefully that looks like it's still spotty. Yeah. Hey, Tim, I wonder whether we might move to your section and then come back to mine. I'm going to see if I can get a better connection rather than using Wi-Fi.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? This is Tim Fry.
Yes, we can hear you fine, Tim.
Okay. So let me see where... Okay, so I'll let Andrew come back to his section. I'm going to just... what I'm going to dive into is an example of how we apply the standards sort of just to pick up right where Andrew left off in his rundown of each of the 10 standards and what the standards can do and what they can't do. So just to give you an idea of how the standards fit into the broader framework of our design guideline documents and our overall visioning for the city, if we look at this slide horizontally and compare side by side, we have a general plan, which is a very high level visionary document, and it sort of talks about the best of, like, what do we want to see San Francisco as a city in sort of best of all possible worlds. The Secretary of Interior standards are much like that. They're these, as Andrew said, they're these 10 basic philosophies, or it's sort of like a framework to outline responsible preservation practices. While they're both regulatory, they don't get it sort of into the weeds on the details of how a project should or should not move forward. What we do is in the next step, which is the planning code, zoning administrator interpretations, or interpreting the standards. This is the area where there's a little more variability in terms of how we interpret the general plan and the standards. As you know, under the planning code through a zoning administrator variance, there can be some flexibility within certain planning code requirements, as long as the overall intent of the code is still being respected. The same thing for the standards. There are thousands of different interpretations that 1,000 different planners or professionals can make about how the standards can be applied. It's not, those interpretations aren't meant to be regulatory, and in some way they're largely based on the professional opinion and practice of those professionals. But where we get into applying these guidelines and these standards or code sections in a much more regulatory sense is like with the residential design guidelines or the design guidelines that are outlined in Articles 10 and 11. And again, 10 and 11 are the articles of the planning code that govern the buildings that are formally designated and protected locally. The residential design guidelines and Article 10 and 11 guidelines have very specific language. Again, not to be prescriptive, still to be flexible, still to be clear, but they have very specific language in there to help property owners, developers, any design professionals know what are those certain elements that should be considered when designing a project. So just to give you, I think, a graphic example of how this is put into play, I'm going to jump into an example, and some of you may be familiar with it. This is, if I can hit the slide. Let me, there, oops. It may take a second. There we go. So this is a property in the Castro neighborhood. Again, some of you may be familiar with it because it sold just recently. Small scale residential building, late 1800s. A developer comes in, wants to rehabilitate the building, and then under permitting, this is how we would review a proposal and apply the Secretary of Interior standards and any other city design guidelines to this property. First, we look at the general plan, and again, this is the large or the broad visioning document. We have two examples here of policies within the general plan, the urban design element and the housing element. Both of these, sort of balance each other out. And one is, use care in remodeling older buildings, acknowledging that there are many parts of the city, even if they're not protected, that we want to maintain because they help enhance the character of San Francisco, the unique character of San Francisco's architectural heritage. And then another policy from the housing element that wants to ensure that we continue to grow, we continue to adapt and accommodate, be able to accommodate new residents and grow substantially without impacting that residential character of the neighborhoods. So then the next step would be look at the zoning, and the zoning here is RH3, which is a fairly high density zoning, residential zoning use, and the height and bulk is 40x. To the left is an aerial shot where you see the red arrow. You can see the flat roof of the building, and that it's nestled in between a much taller building at the corner and then a smaller scale building almost about the same size as the subject property as we go down the hill. And then the next step would be to look at the residential design guidelines. And in page 24, the design guidelines, here if we have a developer or a property owner that wants to add to this building, to grow this building, either to accommodate a growing family or a new tenants, the design guidelines, residential design guidelines, provide a little more feedback on how that addition should be addressed. And here you can see in the graphic to the left that any vertical expansion within a neighborhood that is sort of mixed but generally has a small scale character should provide some sort of transition or modeling to that addition so it fits in well with the remaining or within the surrounding context. And then finally, when we get to the Secretary of Interior standards, here we're dealing with a historically and architecturally significant property. And the Secretary of Interior standards, this is standard 9 that Andrew went over about new additions. And here, while Andrew went over the broad standard as it's listed, one interpretation is a new addition should always be subordinate to the historic building, should not compete in size, scale, or design. So in this case, we look at why is the property significant? It's architecturally significant, we know that. What are its character-defining features? Likely the character-defining features are the architectural components of the building that you can see from the public right-of-way, the double-hung windows, the wood cladding, the shape of the roof line, its overall massing and scale. And then again, how does the project respect those features and what's visible from the public right-of-way? Oh, there was a question about what does height and bulk 40x mean, and just quickly, that's the height and bulk district outlined in this zoning district, which means that's the overall envelope that a development can operate within. Basically, a new development should not be more than 40 feet in height as measured from grade for the property. And then the bulk is basically a mapping requirement. There are some areas of the city that have different bulk requirements, meaning if you go up a certain number of feet, you have to set back additional stories, and that may be to preserve the scale and the context of the neighborhood. That may be to provide a light and air to adjacent properties or to the public right-of-way. But in this case, 40x is pretty much you can build 40 feet lot line to lot line as long as you meet the density requirements. And the density requirements are outlined in the zoning district, which is RH3. So again, back to the Secretary of Interior standards, I outlined some of the questions on how we would apply the standards to a new project. And here's an architectural elevation of the building as it existed before remodeling, facing the street, and then a side elevation along the property line. You can see the property has a tall parapet, or the roof form closer to the front of the street is taller than the actual structure. So when we worked with the property owner, we were able to come up with a plan that they could add a substantial amount of square footage and nestle that, or basically hide that additional square footage behind the existing roof line. So here you can see they expanded to the rear. They added another floor to the top of the building, but we did ask for a setback of anywhere from 12 to 15 feet. In some cases, it's a little bit more. but again, it was to ensure that that addition was subordinate to the overall massing and scale of the building as seen from the public right-of-way. And this is the property today. As you can see, well, aside from painting it a different color, they did do some regrading at the front near the garage. But you can see in both photos in the top right-hand corner, you can see a little bit of the addition peeking out, clearly subordinate, mainly invisible from the public right-of-way, which is the approach that we were trying to achieve. They do have a glass railing because they added outdoor space to that setback area, which is a great solution to capture some of that space. And you can see that previously the building was much smaller than the current size of the building today after development. And this is, I would say, is a good example of our traditional approach to adding to these small scale buildings that we use today. And this is how we would apply those various layers of design guidelines and city policies and achieving something that works both for the city as a whole, but also for the property owner looking to expand. And Jeff just reminded me to also mention how it's also successful because of protecting light and air to adjacent properties, which is always a benefit, the next day neighbors. Not sure, is Andrew on the call again?
Yeah, I'm back. So
able to pick up.
Hopefully, I'm now. I have a hardline
Do you want me to-
connection, so hopefully the sound will be better. Why don't we go back to the Secretary of Standards?
Here's
We can go back. I think
here's
there was a
the
question
slide
about
where you left
whether, yeah, is there any desire? Do I need to review any of the Secretary of Standards again? Maybe people can type in their chat boxes whether there were standards that they wanted me to go over because there was sound kept cutting out during the standards. So I'll move forward, but then I see in the chat box that anybody wants me to review the standards, I can go back to any of the individual standards. So moving on about the Historic Preservation Commission, we are a 7-member body appointed by the mayor, and that we really focus on buildings that or districts that are designated. We also have a landmark work program, so we look at what parts of the city or what buildings should potentially be designated as well, get protection, and that the Board of Supervisors actually approves those designations. So it's a multiple-stepped process. There's a lot of things that we aren't involved in that the planning department is only involved in, and that is the level of environmental review, CEQA review for projects, review of a project just because it's in a survey area. If it's not designated or not in a historic district, we do not deal with those types of properties, and obviously properties that aren't buildings that aren't identified in the planning code. And we typically just look at the impacts that the work has on properties, but we do not deal with changes of use, conditional use, things like that. There are a number of types of approvals that we've delegated administratively to staff, and those include things like window replacements, front stairs, there tend to be kind of smaller work that are more typical and more repetitive. So those actually have a simpler process of getting approval. They can be handled administratively. The types of approvals that we typically work with are, and that do require hearings and a public notice, are when there's a major change to a landmark building or a building in a landmark district, things like additions, garages, roof decks. If let's say you have a historic building that's missing an important feature and you're putting it back, that would potentially come back before us as well. So those are the types of things that the commission actually deals with, tends to be larger scale projects. One of the things we look at that's very important is in this process, we really want to understand the history of the property and its significance. So this is the house on Market Street that is a designated landmark, the Miller Juiced House, and it's important to really understand what's happened over time, to see historic documentation, to see historic information about the property, and then the current state of the property. So we're really trying to get an understanding about the building, the project, to get a very clear picture of the project and to understand the building. So I would say as applicants come forward with projects, the thing that's most important is really clear documentation. Clear documentation on the history of your project, on the history of the building, and just really clear information. What will happen as the project moves forward is we're going to look at the character defining features of the building, and we're going to look at how the changes affect those character defining features. And these character defining features are already identified in the landmark designation report. So every building or every district has a report, a designation report, that explains why the building was significant, why it was originally designated, and describes the features that are important and should be protected. And this, for example, is the new Dubose Park district, and the types of things that were called out in the landmark designation are the overall form, continuity, scale, and proportion of the district, just that it's very harmonious. You can see in this photograph that the houses are all kind of the same height and scale and sort of a very repetitive. That there's a window pattern that is very similar, so we'd be looking at things like maintain the character of those windows. That the materials and finishes are very consistent in this district, that they're very consistent architectural details, so those are the kind of things that are important. That a lot of the houses have Queen Anne design elements, like the type of bay windows that they have, the type of the shape of the roofs. There are also Edwardian era design elements, and that there are certain landscape elements, things like that. So those are the kinds of things, the details, the finishes, those are the things that we would look for in this district that would be maintained if you were doing an alteration or a new addition. The Historic Preservation Commission does have a committee called the Architectural Review Committee, and it's 3 members of the HPC. We all have expertise in design and construction. I'm on the Architectural Review Committee right now. And this committee is a very beneficial one for projects because it's a chance for an applicant to get guidance on a project, to ask questions about a project, to propose various solutions. And it's an easy process to go through that you can do before you actually go to the full commission, which is kind of a much more formal process. So this is an informal way to get input on whether your project meets the standards, on whether your project has what it needs to be approved, whether you have the documentation that you need. You might have several alternatives that you could present to the Architectural Review Committee and get their opinion on which one is most in compliance with the standards. So it's an opportunity for applicants to really get that early input on their design. Now I'm going to go through a little case study of some new construction in the Alamo Square Historic District, and just talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we're looking at when we get projects and what the review process is like. And I think one of the things that is important to know that it can often be a very iterative design process, that one thing that's very important is the quality of the architecture and the new design, especially when you're doing additions or new construction in historic districts. So this project it's actually these, there's the white building on the corner there of Grove and Steiner, and it's the 3 buildings to the left of that there was a non-historic building that was demolished there, and so this was an opportunity to build 3 new houses. And this was the very first proposal that the applicant came with to do these 3 houses, in which they're kind of quasi-historic, but not really. They don't really look like the Queen, the houses around it, but they've got certain elements. And in this one, we really looked at it and we said, this does not have the sort of the scale, the massing, the sense of detail that the historic buildings had. And that it wasn't necessarily that we needed to see buildings that exactly mimic the Victorian buildings, but that the character, the depth, the scale was lacking. So for example, in the house that's immediately to the left of that white house, the facades are very flat. There's no sense of depth to the facades themselves. If you look at the Victorians further down, you can see how there are kind of a lot of ins and outs. The roofs project. There's a lot of layers of detail. And this was a very, very flat facade. So even though in a drawing, in a pure elevation drawing, it might have looked like it had those historic elements, three-dimensionally, it doesn't really have the same character, the same texture, the same scale or massing that the other the buildings in the district had. A subsequent proposal then that was looking at modifying it to provide more sense of detail and more similarity to the repetitive roof forms in the district. So this was a change for the better, but it still was not particularly distinguished in its character. Still, the facades have a kind of certain flatness to them. The glass railings don't really feel appropriate to this district. So this was still lacking in compatibility with the district. The final solution that was approved was actually a very contemporary solution. This is the approved solution, in which the 3 houses have bay windows, but the bays are slightly different. They have a similar repetitive roof form. They use a contemporary language, but there's much more depth to the facades. So there's more of a recess where the roofs project, and the element right underneath the roof is much further back. There are more planes in terms of the way the facades are all collected. Getting some audio.
Yes, it's Amy Louie. Please press *6 on your phone. I'm unable to mute you from here.
Hello?
Okay. Can you please press *6 on your phone, Amy? Thanks. Thank you very much. All right, we're good.
So this is really what the process is like, working both with the Architectural Review Committee and the Historic Preservation Commission, trying to find a solution that has features that are similar to the historic district without exactly mimicking it. So it is a process that can be time-consuming. It definitely helps if you have a good architect working with you. I think that's probably one of the most important things in this panel we can recommend for your clients, to advise them to select architects who know the process, who've done this type of work, and who have a reputation for quality in the types of work that they do. So now I'm going to hand it back to Tim, unless I didn't hear whether we wanted me to go, if there was a desire for me to go through the standards or not. Maybe when we get back to the Q&A, we can address that there. And yes, this was one builder that did all 3 houses. So Tim, are you ready to take back over? Tim and Jeff?
Yes, this is Jeff. So if the Secretary of the Interior standards are the 10 Commandments, I'm going to get into a little bit of the fine print of the 10 Commandments. Let's get ahead. So the San Francisco Planning Department has developed numerous guidelines and standards that and documents containing them that describe approaches to various elements that are frequently brought in for modification and warrants specific attention. We're going to cover a couple of those that are specific to residential here. We've got others that, such as sign guidelines and storefront guidelines, and others that address other components. So I'm going to start with garages. We have a document identified here, guidelines for adding garages and curb cuts, that, again, specifically, the document specifically intends to give as much guidance as possible to prospective projects to lead them down a path that's consistent with the requirements and expectations associated with the Secretary of Interior standards. Some of those elements of specific concern that need to be addressed when considering a new garage opening are listed here. Those elements, again, that would be associated with the specific case in hand. So in the case of reviewing garages, typically what's going to occur is contact with planning through either a direct contact through one of the preservation planners, or coming into the Planning Information Center, which we'll talk a little more about at the end, and speaking with the preservation planner there. One of the challenges in our particular environment with garages is that many of these buildings were not designed with an intention to incorporate a garage and really do not lend themselves to it. This case here, like the ones in the slide preceding, are examples where attempting to bring a garage into the building would be extremely destructive to various historic features. In this case, it's pretty easy to imagine that it would be hard to do it without the car actually parking itself in the living room. Probably not an ideal solution for most of your clients anyway. But generally, we're in a city with steep slopes in many locations, modest setbacks. The challenge of getting parking underneath an existing structure that was never designed with that intention is not consistently achievable. There are other considerations identified here, such as on-street parking, street trees, and the nature of the streets themselves that, again, may contribute to a determination that either parking is within the structure is not achievable, or that some extraordinary treatments might be necessary in order to allow it to occur. So we're going to look at a couple of examples, mostly positive. I think there's one maybe not so positive that hopefully will help describe the nature of the target, what we're looking for, what is achievable, so that you can give good advice to your prospective clients or to a prospective development. Here are two examples where, again, there was sufficient lift already present in the main floor of the house that allowed for insertion of a garage underneath without extreme modification to the structure. On the left, again, a relatively modest rake down to the garage, and opportunity to provide that most minimum curb cut necessary and allowable while still maintaining that sense of vegetation, that sense of front yard that we consider intrinsic to the historic qualities of some of these houses. On the right, in some ways, an even better example. Again, a little easier, clearly because of the level grade, or better than level grade, allowing for that garage, and the introduction of some greenscape treatment that we're seeing more and more and encouraging more and more. Again, particularly in those examples where projects are already featuring landscaping that's really part of the texture of that neighborhood, and also specifically appropriate to that structure. Here's one more example. Inventive in a different way. Again, while the little bit of shrubbery has been only minimally invoked by what planners were able to be squeezed in on either side of the drive. There's another aspect here, which is that the services for the house were actually plugged in, the utility services, under that stairwell. So the freeing up of that yard area and access under the stair created another kind of opportunity to hide gas meters and other utility boxes. One other aspect of this proposal in particular, you can note of course, the removal of the iron rail in order to allow this curb cut. If that rail were particularly historic, there would be a little more of a discussion about whether or not it was appropriate, and whether or not there was an opportunity to reuse or preserve that rail in some other manner. And onto window replacement, a topic which is discussed at great length in the context of these kinds of discussions throughout the land. And San Francisco, of course, is no exception. Again, window replacement, we have standards for, somewhat indicative of the level of concern and attention we apply to this problem. Is the fact that this document is quite lengthy for the scale of the topic. So it's roughly twice as long, for example, as the garage document that we just discussed. Again, speaking to the sort of level of detail we're interested in, there are a number of components of windows that we care about. It's both the quality, the material, the texture, the recess, the surround. It's both specific to the building at hand and also specific to the nearby context. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's one example of both the nature of the problem and why we care. These are two windows applied clearly in a single wall. On the right, the original; on the left, replacement. And this, per our guidelines, is an unsuccessful treatment on the left in a number of respects. The flattening of the trim surround is a large and unfortunate change that really fundamentally changes the character of the window component. The window itself features simulated divided lights. The material is vinyl, which is generally considered problematic and not approvable. Generally, the reason we care about these windows, particularly in even relatively plain buildings like this might be, is that, and in some ways particularly in buildings like this, is that the windows really are the most detailed elements of these buildings. They really contribute fundamentally to their character and quality. Here's another example of a somewhat better solution. While this is still a modern window on the right, and the type of window it's intending to replace on the left, the elements we can see here that have been a little more satisfactorily respected are the proportion of the window frames, the fact that the light dividers, the muttons and mullions, have some dimension, and generally, well, it's not a vinyl treatment, though that might be not entirely clear in this image, but it's some kind of a clad system. Again, generally clad systems are going to be a little more flexible in design. They're considered to be a higher quality for these purposes. There's more flexibility in their the scale of their frames, and in particular in the finish. The one element here that we can see dropped from the original design are the little details at the mid window called OGs, which are quite prevalent here. If that were really considered to be a fundamental intrinsic component of this particular building, really one of the primary character giving features, this might have been a case where we would have pushed harder for something more closely resembling a true replication, though not necessarily going so far as to require a wood replacement. Again, you can see here some of the quality of direction that's provided. This document, to reiterate, embodies many of those principles that you find in the Secretary of Interior standards. So for example, there's an expectation that repair will be considered before replacement. That would be particularly true in cases where the window, again, is really fundamental to the design of the building and its special historic qualities. The example on the left is a perfect one. Now, somebody did ask about Title 24, and I'll tie that in briefly here in terms of this balancing of priorities. I mean, generally, the presumption in the preservation community is that if well maintained and well treated, that the environmental consequence of repair over replacement is a net gain. In other words, that so much energy is used to create a new window that repairing them rather than replacing them with a modern system still makes sense over the life of the building. That becomes potentially even more true when you're looking at a building like this, where the prospect of having radiused, which is to say curved, window frames being developed in thermopane consistent with current Title 24 standards would be inordinately expensive and technically challenging in many cases as well. For that reason, and because of those balancing of those desires, there is flexibility on the part of the building code official when it comes to historic resources, and that this would be the kind of case where we would work together with an owner to invoke that flexibility if necessary. One extremely powerful tool the department has available to the public is the parcel information map, or property information map, accessible on our website. And it's findable in a number of locations. Here it is right up front and center on our opening page. And there are a number of tabs on that page when you actually open that property information map. One of them is a historic tab, and this is showing a screen with that tab selected. And what that page will reveal are any designations, any special historic considerations, whether it be relative to the classification of the specific resource, the specific building, or the fact that it's in a historic district. Those fields will highlight in the manner indicated here. So again, if you click on that, it would give you a definition and further lead you to other information appropriate to evaluate where your property is relative to what you're considering for it. I mentioned the Planning Information Center. The PIC is located at 1660 Mission Street. I suspect many of you have been there from time to time. We have preservation technical specialists at the PIC on as regular schedule as achievable. They're not there all the time, so it is necessary to check the schedule to ensure if you need that special information. These elements that I've talked about, garages and windows, can and need to be reviewed by a technical specialist in order to determine whether or not the intended approaches are appropriate and approvable. That's true of every window treatment on an elder structure. Likewise with garages and other proposed modifications to historic structures. So I welcome you to visit the PIC as often as necessary and desirable. And often many of these permits, once we've gotten them to a point of acceptability, can be approved over the counter. And finally, here are some links to get you more directly to those resources. I believe we're now ready for any other questions from the audience.
Great, thank you very much, Jeff. I had a number of questions come in during the course of the presentation, so I'll start in the order that they were received. The first question, and actually I think was posed when Andrew was speaking, and it's coming from Val, and she's asking regarding repair versus replace, how does meeting energy compliance for T24 impact window repairs, for example? And I think that was partially covered in Jeff's portion.
Yeah, I think that was pretty well covered in Jeff's portion. I mean, I would say just related to repair versus replace, if you're dealing with a landmark property, there's really going to be a strong desire to do as much repair as possible rather than replace wherever is possible. So that's generally the preference. But that obviously you are able to do window replacements if your windows are very deteriorated, and if you can get your windows to match the profiles, the exterior profiles, it is possible in certain circumstances to do double glazed windows. So it really does depend on the condition of the windows and also the proposed appearance of the new replacement windows. I don't know if Jeff, you want to add anything to
that? No, I think you hit the sort of remaining point, which is that even in those technically challenging circumstances, money not being an issue, and sometimes even not being fundamentally problematic, there are ways to introduce higher performing glazing into existing frames.
Okay, we just posed a poll to see if anybody wanted you to represent the Secretary of Interior Standards. I think people got a pretty good sense of it, so we won't have to represent it, but I'll send everybody the slides by the end of the day. Another question that came up was what if you, and this is specifically related to the garages portion, for garages, what if you raised the building within the height limits?
I think this was about that example, Jeff, that you gave for the one that would be very challenging, where the building, the bay window was pretty much at street level.
And I would add, if we can go back to, I think it's this slide here, there are some cases where raising a building within the height limit makes sense. This is an example, though, where raising the building could alter the surrounding context. Here we have three very similar cottages. If one wanted to insert a garage, it would disrupt the overall scale and roof form pattern along the public right-of-way, so we would likely discourage that. But there are cases where we have allowed the raising of a building to insert a garage. We generally look at it on a case-by-case basis. I would say, as a rule of thumb, raising a building slightly, less than 18 inches, so less than 1.5 feet, is generally a nominal change to a building. And so if a garage can be achieved through that nominal raising, those are generally supported. However, we do occasionally see proposals to raise buildings 3 and 4 feet above the existing current location. And that, we found, is a pretty radical change to a building's overall form and massing, and could alter its significance. So generally, raising a building that high to insert a garage is discouraged, but I would say for the most part we've been able to come up with solutions that have allowed most of those interested in inserting a garage to be able to do so. And sometimes it's a combination of excavation and raising the building, but again, we'd have to look at them on a case-by-case basis.
I think there was a follow-up question in relation to that, and the question was, what about on a flat historic facade by using a blind door?
What about on a flat facade using a blind door? That has been used occasionally, and we are amenable or open to looking at those designs that introduce a blind door. We found an interesting result of using a blind door. Sometimes results in some conflicts between the public realm and even other cars, because they're not aware that there's a driveway in that location. And I know some property owners that have used a blind door have ended up routinely towing cars that park in front of their garage because most folks don't see a garage door, and they think it's a legal parking spot. But we certainly could work with somebody if they were interested in introducing a blind door.
Okay, another question came up twice from two different people, and they were asking about windows. And they were wondering if the windows guidelines are only for historic properties?
No, the window standards apply to all properties within San Francisco. There may be additional requirements regarding windows for landmark properties if that designating ordinance and that case report that Andrew was mentioning earlier dictate a different approach to window replacement, but the standards are meant to be used universally for all properties within San Francisco.
Okay, the next question that came up was if a Category A historic resource is under, I'm guessing under the, I don't know what this question means, under jurisdiction or designated by, I'm not sure, but the Historic Preservation Commission or planners. So I think they're wondering how a Category A historic resource is designated, whether it happens through the commission or through the planners.
Andrew, you want to answer that?
Well, the category A is a known historic resource. Is that there's a
Right.
historic resource present, so it's been identified in a survey, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's designated as a landmark.
Yeah, I think the
Correct.
question was in relation to, yeah,
I put the
who has
slide up that
authority
shows
over it. Okay. Okay, yeah, so the question was about who has authority or
So
under what jurisdiction it is.
So the commission has review authority under or for properties only listed to Articles 10 and 11 of the Planning Code, and those are the properties that are highlighted on the map that I just switched over on your screen. So these are the only properties that require a certificate of appropriateness or a permit to alter. All other properties would be reviewed at the staff level by the Planning Department preservation staff. In the case where we have an Category 8 property, meaning it's a known historic resource, just to add more confusion to that, yeah, some of those known historic resources are designated and others are not. But we could certainly help you answer that question at the Planning Information Center, or if you called the department, and we'd let you know what the proper path is for permit review for that property. And then just to go back to Andrew's previous slide about what can be covered by the HPC in terms of review and what they've delegated back to us. As you can see from this slide, the majority of work, even to those landmark properties, has been delegated back to staff. So most work to buildings that are known historic resources do not require a hearing before the HPC. It's only in the case where, one, the building is a landmark, and two, the work is substantial enough that the HPC has indicated that they want to see it, is when we have to do the public notice and the hearing. And that HPC approval is that small list that's on the slide over to the right-hand side.
And I think to add some additional clarification to this, any building over 50 years old is a potential historic resource if it has not been surveyed or there's been no report on it. So just that it's a potential historic resource just because it's over 50 years old. It doesn't mean that it would be considered a historic resource. The city has been undertaking many surveys. There is a strong desire to do a survey of the entire city, so that will happen over time. And so then we'd be able to have identified which ones actually are historic resources, which ones are just potential. If it's Category A and it's a identified historic resource, it might just have been identified in a survey that is actually a historic resource, or it's in a potential historic district. But as Tim said, it doesn't mean that it is actually designated or landmarked. It would show on the property information map if it was actually in a landmark district or an individual landmark that is actually called out. And then you can actually, I think almost all properties on those, you can actually then, there's a link to the actual designation report on that page.
Okay, great. Another question that came up from Anna, she has client considering a property that is designated A, Category A, historic resource, present under historic preservation, and B, potential historic resource under the historic resource section. The property needs significant work and my client would like to add a garage if possible. How do you analyze potential improvements with the two different designations?
Yeah, I think we did just answer that question. Hopefully the answer we gave was comprehensive enough. But the two different designations, the B is only because it's over 50 years old. The A is the fact that it's a historic resource is the one that's important. So and it would depend on whether it was identified. Likely it's probably not designated as a landmark. If it's only considered potential, then it wouldn't have that designation. But then that would be through working with the planning department.
And yeah, just to add on to that, I would encourage, even conceptually, to bring some drawings or some ideas to the Planning Information Center during a preservation shift, and we can sit down and work through some options for the site. There's certainly plenty of different approaches that we can use, and once we have a better idea of what the owner or the potential owner wants to do, we can give them some guidance or some advice on that.
A general question is, what defines a historic resource aside from age and notable architect?
I can take a brief stab at that. So, what defines a
Well,
historic resource is
a
it
building can
has
or a property
has.
can be.
Tim, are you answering that one?
Go ahead, Andrew. No, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to. A historic resource, it could be architecture, it could be significant events or historic events that have happened in that house. So it could be for other historical reasons, it could be association with certain individuals or certain things that happen there. So there'll be a number of things that we'll look at. One of the things that's also very important in order for a building to be considered a historic resource or to be designated, it has to maintain integrity. So that would mean that if it is a house of a certain period, let's say of the modern period, and built by a famous architect, and there's a reason that it's one of his finer works, but in fact most of the facade and the windows have been replaced already and they don't exist, it's possible that it wouldn't have the integrity to be considered a historic resource. So it depends a lot on not only on the significance of the building, but it's also integrity means its ability to still convey that significance.
Great. And I don't know if Tim had anything to follow up on that.
No, I think Andrew covered
okay.
that.
And the another question that came up was if there are different levels of A designation, and I'm guessing there are.
Yeah, I mean, technically there are. I think the A, the B, and the C is really an internal tracking measure for us. If you do have if you do see a property that is listed as a known resource, it's basically a flag to let you know that you should talk to a preservation planner or involve a preservation planner in your project. Again, an A building can be designated at the local level, it could be designated at the federal level under the National Register, or it could have just been identified in a survey. Each of those properties will have a different path or a different process associated with it. As you know, we live in a very process-heavy jurisdiction, but we could certainly give you a clear path and a clear direction once we sit down with you and talk about, or the property owner, and talk about what the proposed project is.
Yeah, I would add one thing to that is that in landmark districts, there are buildings that are listed as contributing structures and those that are non-contributing to the district. So a contributing one would be one that conveyed the historic character of the district. A non-contributing one would be one that was built after the district's period of significance and what didn't have those characteristics. But because the non-contributing building is still in a district, changes to that building will still need to be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission or be delegated to the planning department depending on the extent of those changes. So it's not just a free pass because it's considered non-contributing.
That's a good point.
Okay, and another question just now came through. We probably have time for one or two more. So if anybody has any final questions, please type them in the chat box. The question that just came was, how do you deal with a historic resource that's been badly damaged and or abandoned?
Tim, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Well, I mean, a building that's determined to be a historic resource that may not be in the best condition, or may have an absentee property owner, you know, would if the building's considered a historic resource, we would still treat it as such. Not only the planning department, but the Department of Building Inspection have certain requirements and code provisions to ensure or enforce neglected properties to be brought into compliance with the code. So if we were we're more of a complaint-driven department. Excuse me, we don't go around, making sure that everybody's following the rules. But if someone were to bring one of these properties to our attention, we would certainly investigate it. And if there was a cause for concern, we would contact the property owner to see if we could work something out and to make sure the building is maintained and rehabilitated to bring it to current life safety standards. And naturally, the Department of Building Inspection would be heavily involved in that as well.
Okay, so it appears there are no further questions. And of course, if anybody has any questions that come to mind, feel more than free to email me and I will forward them to these speakers. I'll send an email later today with the recording of the session and the documents that were mentioned during the course of the presentation, including the guide on garages and window replacements. It seems that somebody is typing, Val is typing a question. This can be our final question before I close the session. What if repair to the resource requires creating false history? I think she's referring to the badly damaged or abandoned property.
Andrew, do you want to?
Sure. The question was, what if the repairs create a sense of false history? Is that what the question was?
Yeah, what if repair to the resource requires creating false history?
Well, typically we would look for as much information. So let's say if there's a property and it's damaged or there's pieces missing, we would look to see whether there's signs of what the was there before. So as much information as possible of what was there before. That can sometimes be seen from ghosting. From tracings on the wall. Sometimes there's material that's underneath other material, like asphalt shingles are applied over a wood facade. So that would be one thing we'd look for. Another thing we would look for is if it's in a building that has a lot of similar buildings that were built at the same time, we would look for consistency with the buildings, let's say, if it was in a district. So if there's a series of houses adjacent that were very, very similar, we feel more comfortable if what's used is similar to what's in the district. So the false, I think we're trying to have houses or buildings that are harmonious when they're kind of put back together. So I think there are ways also that if there's not enough documentary information, that something compatible can be put back that relates to the architecture, but that is done in a way that is maybe a little bit more contemporary in its installation so that there isn't the false history. So there's usually ways around creating the false history.
Great,
yeah,
and
this is Jeff.
That closes our...
Adding on to that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
No, go ahead.
So sorry. So just to build on that a tiny bit, we don't have a document that speaks directly and perfectly to that topic. Particularly the latter part of Andrew's discussion about looking at, say, for example, a facade that's been stripped of all ornamentation, that's in a context where it's clear that, or seems clear that it's likely that it had a different aesthetic at a different point in time. We are beginning the process of developing what we're referring to as a local interpretation of the Secretary of Interior standards, and we anticipate that topic will be one of interest to a lot of folks interested in preservation of many of the types of structures that we've been referring to. My expectation would be that one of the results of that process that'll be embedded in that document will be a little more direction about just what that process of assessment is, what those expectations would be, in order for us all to have a better common understanding of expectations and appropriate results in those circumstances.
Excellent. I wanted to thank all of our speakers today, Jeff Jocelyn, Tim Fry, Andrew Wolfram. The recording will be made available to you by the end of the day if you had any audio issues or you missed a portion of the session. Thank you all for attending. For those of you who are here today, you won't have to complete the quiz. I will still send you a quiz link if you'd like to take it. You're more than welcome to. The next session is on next Thursday, the 26th of June, and it'll cover financial incentives and sustainability. Right now, what I'm going to do is pull up the evaluation page. You'll notice the helpful resources box is blank, but I promise to send you links by the end of the day. On the left-hand side is a survey that you're probably familiar with at this point, but if you haven't taken it, please do. There are spots on the bottom of the page to provide written feedback. I wanted to congratulate everybody. You're now 3/4 of the way through the certification program. And by the time you're complete next Thursday, you'll soon receive a certificate of completion. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any further questions. And please enjoy the rest of your day. I'll leave this window up for a few more minutes, but I'm going to turn the sound off. Thanks again for your time.